Students of the way, we should not study the Buddha Dharma for the sake of our own ego-centered self. We should study the Buddha Dharma simply for the sake of the Buddha Dharma. The genuine way to do so is to completely cast away body and mind, leaving nothing behind, and dedicating ourselves to the great ocean of the Buddha Dharma. After that, without being concerned about the right and wrong of each thing, without clinging to our own views, even if it is difficult to endure, we should allow ourselves to be used by the Buddha Dharma when doing things. Even if we want to do something, we should give it up if it is not in accordance with the principles of the Buddha Dharma. We should never expect to obtain good results in exchange for our efforts in practicing the Buddha way. Once we are dedicated to the Buddha way, we should never look back at ourselves. We should just continue practicing in accordance with the regulations of the Buddha Dharma without considering twisted personal views. The examples of past practitioners have all been like this. When we no longer seek anything on the basis of our ego-centered mind, this itself is great peace and joy. Those who have never kept company with others in the world and have grown up only with their own families behave as they wish and put priority on fulfilling their own heart's desires. They never think of how others see them and do not care how others feel. Without fail, such people are bad. The points to watch in practicing the way are also like this. We should keep company with others in the Sangha and follow our teacher without setting up personal views. If we continue reforming our minds in this way, we will easily become people of the way. So, good morning, everyone. That was Book 6, Section 2 of Shobogenzo Zuimonki, which I'll be talking about today. So Hojo-san has made a new translation of this text. There are two existing sort of manuscript witnesses of this text, and the one that's been available in print in English translation is from the what's called the popular version, which was prepared by a scholar of the Edo period, so in like the 18th century. He worked with some manuscripts. Unfortunately, we don't know which manuscripts those were really, and published his kind of revised version of this. So he made a number of edits and changes, it seems, in this process, but we don't really know how that happened. And then more recently, I think in the early 20th century, a scholar found an older manuscript of the text in a temple. The temple is called Choenji. So this version that Hojo-san translated is called the Choenji version. The ordering of the text is slightly different. It has, I think, just one section that's not found in the other one. And then there are a few like kind of little differences where things are presented differently, and they seem to suggest that maybe Menzan made changes in those spots. So anyways, we're getting close finally to getting this thing published. It's been a very long process because I'm slow and lazy, but at the same time nitpicky and perfectionist. So it's been very, very slow, which is completely my fault. Hojo-san had finished his part a long time ago. But at any rate, we have the proofs back now, so it should be published early next year. So I am still finding a lot of mistakes, though. Lots of, long, in Japanese, you indicate like a long vowel with a macron over the vowel. And that was like I wanted to have all those included. But then, of course, I missed a bunch of them. So I'm still finding places where I messed that up. So anyways, I'll just speak a little bit about the text, and then today I'd like to talk about one particular aspect of Dogen's teaching in this text, which is freedom from personal views. So Hojo-san, in his introduction, kind of summarizes the main points that Dogen makes in this text. And he lists them as seeing impermanence, departing from the ego-centered self, being free from greed, giving up self-attachment, following a true teacher, and following the practice of Zazen, specifically Shikantaza. So I'll be talking about freedom from personal views. So the text Shobogenzo Zuimonki is basically Koun Eijo, so that was Dogen's primary disciple. He's the person who became the abbot of Eiheiji after Dogen died. They're his notes on Dogen's lectures, sort of his more informal lectures. So he joined the Sangha, Dogen Sangha, in 1234. And this was at Koshoji, which was the temple that Dogen founded outside of Kyoto. So this was before the founding of Eiheiji, which is out in the boonies. Eijo had practiced with another Zen teacher from this group of Zen practitioners called the Nihon Daruma Shu, so the Japanese Bodhidharma school, basically. And this was it was actually the first Zen group in Japan, but they had sort of bad credentials, you could say. So the person who founded it read some Zen texts and then basically wrote a letter to a Zen master in China and said, this is my insight, or my awakening, please certify it. And somehow this guy was like, okay, yeah, you've got enlightenment. And he sort of got mail order awakening. And so he had a group of followers. They were sort of outcasts, I think, from the Buddhist tradition writ large. So they weren't very well liked. And Eijo himself, initially, like Dogen, was in the Tendai school, which was one of the dominant schools in Japan at the time. And he found himself sort of similar to Dogen, dissatisfied with it for whatever reason. There's some texts that give some suggestions as to why this might be. We don't really know if they're kind of fabricated after the fact or not, but one suggests that his mother encouraged him to be sort of a genuine practitioner, not just to practice for the sake of fame and profit. And so he decided to leave partially on that basis. When he left, he initially practiced in the Pure Land School, which was also an emergent school at the time. He, again, we don't really know why, but he left and started practicing with this Zen group after a while. And he somehow heard that Dogen was coming back from visiting China, where he had practiced Zen there. So he, there's this quotation. I don't think I didn't print it out here, but basically he says something along the lines of, I've mastered the teachings of Tendai and the Pure Land teachings about Amitabha, and I've had Kensho, so sort of like an awakening experience through practicing in this Zen tradition. So this guy Dogen probably doesn't have anything to teach me, but I'll just sort of check it out just to see what he experienced over in China. And so he goes to meet with Dogen. So this is just after he had come back from China. He hadn't set up his own temple yet, so he was practicing at the same temple that he had been practicing before he went to China. This is Keninji. And so he has this sort of these series of conversations with Dogen, and he's telling Dogen his view on things, and then after some point, Dogen starts to talk about the way that he understands things, and Eijo sort of has the rug pulled out from under him. He feels like, after having heard what Dogen has said about his insights, that he actually doesn't really understand anything at all, and that his supposed understanding of Buddhism was all wrong. So Hojo-san notes that when he started practicing with Dogen, he may have felt like he needed to kind of deconstruct everything that he knew and then reconstruct it again. So taking notes on Dogen's lectures to produce this text that we have, Shobogenzo Zuimonki, may have been part of that process of sort of him trying to rebuild his understanding of Buddhism. So again, Eijo ended up, so this conversation was supposed to have happened several years before, because Dogen didn't have his own temple. He said, come back later once I've kind of gotten things off the ground. So that in 1234, Eijo comes and joins this temple, Koshoji, outside of Kyoto. And so these lectures are recorded from 1234 until 1238. So this is all during the time that they're practicing at Koshoji, so before they go to found Eiheiji, which is not until 1243. So There was a lot of stuff that happened at Koshoji during this time. So they were the first temple in Japan to have a sort of formal monks hall. So these are called sodo. And, it's a kind of a specific design of hall that's, particular to Zen traditions, I think. And so at any rate, Koshoji had the first one in Japan. So it was kind of a big deal. And all these local patrons and stuff got really excited about it because, they felt they were endorsing the true Buddha way from China. And so it seems that from this point on, things got really busy at Koshoji. And shortly after they completed the monks' hall, they also built a Dharma hall, a hato, which is like the traditional building for delivering sermons. And once that was done, Dogen started giving more formal talks. These are called jodo, and there's another text called Eihei Koroku, the Dogen's extensive record, that records all of these. So they're all written down, and those would have been the more formal talks that he gave, whereas Shobogenzo Zuimonki records informal talks, many of them before they had this appropriate hall for giving the formal talks. Let's see here. Okay, so Hojo-san in his introduction notes that the teachings that we find in Shobogenzo Zuimonki are really basic Buddhist teachings that are more or less common to all types of Buddhism. Maybe not the Shikantaza part exactly, but most of the other stuff is sort of basic Buddhism. And those points that I listed, so the things that are emphasized here, seeing impermanence, departing from the ego-centered self, being free from greed, giving up self-attachment, those are all kind of encapsulated in what are called the 3 seals or the 4 seals, depending on which version you're looking at. I think the early tradition used 3 seals and then a 4th one was added later. But the four seals here are impermanence, suffering, no self, and nirvana. And these are seals in the sense of like a stamp, like a certification stamp. And the idea here is if a doctrine has these 4 things, then it's a Buddhist doctrine. If it contradicts them in some way, then it's not a true Buddhist teaching. And Hojo-san in his introduction says that, impermanence and no self from a Buddhist perspective are reality as it is. That is true reality. If we fail to see true reality, then we suffer. So that's the second seal there, right? Suffering. But if we do see these things, that's nirvana. So these are both kind of different, valences of viewing the same true reality. And that encapsulates all of those, things that Hojo-san noted that are the main points of this text. You can also look at this, Hojo-san notes, in terms of the 4 Noble Truths, which are, more well-known maybe than the 3 or 4 seals. So, we have the truth of suffering as the first noble truth. The cause of suffering being our attachment or thirst for, stuff for this self. The 3rd truth being the cessation of suffering, and the 4th being the path for the cessation of suffering. So that is following the Noble Eightfold Path. So again, we can think of the Noble Eightfold Path as being a way of seeing true reality and impermanence and no self. And if we fail to follow that path, we suffer, as in what we were already doing before, as the first truth noted. And if we, successfully follow out the path, then that's nirvana. So, in regards to the topic that I'll touch on today, so personal views, freedom from personal views. So if we see based on our personal, habitual ways, then we're not seeing no self, obviously, because, we're basing everything on the self. And also not seeing impermanence, because the basis for no self is the fact that everything is impermanent. And as a result, we suffer. So, as a result, Dogen focuses frequently on freedom from personal views. And I think it's important to note the word choice that Hojo-san had here, freedom from personal views, not kind of absence of personal views or getting rid of personal views, but freedom from them. They're sort of oppressive in a way. We think that our personal views are great because, we love ourselves so much, but, really they limit us in ways that we can't even really appreciate because we're so locked into that way of viewing the world. So it really is a kind of freedom that's being expressed here. Okay, so I'm basically just going to go through a few passages and, provide a little bit of commentary. But the nice thing about Shobogenzo Zuimonki is that it's compared to the Shobogenzo that we know and love, it's very clear. So you can really just read through this thing and basically get all of it without having to consult a big commentary or something. There are a few kind of little allusions to things that you might not get, and that's the nice thing about this new version of the text that we've prepared. It's got tons of footnotes, so if you get this in spring of 2022, you can answer all your questions you got about the text. So okay, this is book 6, section 14 of Shobogenzo Zuimonki. People of the world say of themselves, although I listen to my master's sayings, they do not satisfy my mind. I think such a statement is mistaken. How are such thoughts possible? Do they have their own understanding of the principles of the sacred teachings and so on, and consider everything that does not coincide with their opinions to be wrong? If so, why do they consult their masters? Or do they say such things because their views are rooted in habitual deluded sentiment? If this is the case, these are delusory thoughts from the beginningless beginning. An essential point we should keep in mind in our study of the way is that we should give up and reform our egotistical views. Even if some teachings go against our own preferences, if these are our master's sayings or statements from the sacred scriptures, we must follow them for the time being. This is the genuine mental attitude in the study of the way. So I think that this kind of is a little bit tricky for us because, I think especially as maybe Americans, I think having personal views and doing things your own way is a very American kind of attitude. So I think for us as Western or American practitioners, kind of hearing this type of thing, that you should just give up your own views and accept what your teacher says, kind of rubs us the wrong way. It's sort of similar to doing prostrations. When I teach the getting started class that we have here, sometimes people have we teach how to do a full prostration, putting your head on the ground and putting your hands above your head to a statue. People, again, I think as Americans, it seems kind of un-American to do a prostration because we're really putting ourselves below everything else. And so, but I think it's important to note that he says, we must follow them for the time being. He's not saying that this, if your teacher is some kind of abusive, crazy person with their own off the wall views, that you need to absolutely accept them. And he actually has a section later on where he talks about, using your own judgment to a certain extent. But I think by and large, unless something seems totally wrong in a way that's, unhealthy, I think that this is important to not just immediately assume that, you must know what's right and the teacher is wrong. This is also why it's important to find, a teacher initially who you can sort of give yourself up to some extent. And I think that's where, you're kind of using your discerning judgment is kind of in that process. I think we have a pretty good sense after spending some time with someone, if they're full of shit or not, at least hopefully. And so, obviously you don't want to be giving yourself up to a person like that. So you have to use your BS detector in the early stages. But then once you've decided to sort of go with a teacher, you need to, I think, accept what's being given and not question everything. So moving on with this passage here, so it's still in the same section. Early on, among my fellow practitioners, there was one who visited masters while clinging strongly to his own views. He refused to accept whatever differed from his opinions, saying that it did not make sense to him, and held on to only what accorded with his own views. He spent his whole life in vain without understanding the Buddha Dharma. Observing his attitude, I realized that studying the way should not be like that. I followed my master's sayings and, to a degree, attained the truth of the way. Later, I found the following passage while reading a scripture. And he quotes here, "If you wish to study the Buddha Dharma, do not continue to hold on to a conditioned mind of the past, present, and future." I understood that we must gradually reform previous thoughts without holding firmly to them. In a text it is said, and again he quotes here, "Good advice sounds harsh to the ear." And I think that that's, an important point here, is that if something really is good advice, it's going to probably rub us the wrong way at first, and we really need to not just immediately reject something out of hand, but let it, stew a little bit. I find that often, since my practice, I think I've gotten a little bit better at that. Often I'll find that things that, I didn't like at the time that they happened later became kind of important teachings to me. I remember, practicing with Shoryu, my Dharma brother, and he has a certain way, obviously, of running things at his temple, and he had I think like a specific towel like for cleaning the floor, and then a specific towel for washing your hands, and a specific one for doing the dishes, which is a perfectly sensible system. And I think I was using so the bottom, he lives off the grid and has this fridge that runs on solar power, and it collects kind of moisture on the bottom occasionally, and you have to kind of mop it out. And I'd use, I can't remember which towel, I think maybe I used the floor towel or something in there because it was kind of grody, and I was like, oh, well, this is dirty, so the floor towel is the appropriate towel. And so I'm doing this, and he says, that's not the right towel to use, please use this other towel. And I sort of argued with him, and I was like, but it's dirty, I should use this one. And he's like, please use the other towel. And he just said that, he didn't try to argue why I needed to use it. He just said, please use the other towel. And, it rubbed me the wrong way at the time, but looking back on it and then kind of seeing other people's behavior maybe that sort of matched what I was doing, I realized that, I'm in his space and I should respect his way of doing things. So, that's a very kind of mundane example, I guess, but I think it is important that, to recognize that something that might seem harsh to the ear might prove to be good advice. And then Dogen continues here, "Words that are said faithfully on our behalf are offensive to our ears. Even though it may be contrary to our preferences, if we force ourselves to follow this advice and carry it out, there will be benefits in the end." So again, just continuing with that point. And I think often in our practice, it's like this too, because here in our lineage, we practice a very difficult sesshin, and our body tells us, you don't want to do that. Don't do that. That's painful. But whenever we do it, I think we find that there are benefits. I'm kind of particularly, I think scared of our sesshin here, but whenever I do it, I feel glad that I did it, So I think that we really have to, like he says, if we force ourselves to follow this advice, sometimes we really just have to force ourselves to do things that we know are good for us, even though, our ego-centered self is saying, no, don't do that. You want comfort. You want lots of good food and lots of sleep. So I'm going to continue on here to another section. So this is book 2, section 10. And I should say too that, if anyone's following along, these sections are slightly different in this version compared to the other one. So I think that the last book becomes the first book in Menzan's version, then everything is shifted back. In the tradition of the ancestors, the true way of understanding a Zen sermon is to follow the teacher's words and to gradually reform the mind that has known and thought various fixed concepts since time immemorial. So it's kind of a similar point here. Even if we had previously thought that a Buddha has excellent characteristics, is fully equipped with radiant light, and has the virtue of preaching the Dharma and benefiting living beings like Shakyamuni or Amitabha, we should nonetheless believe our teacher if he tells us that a Buddha is nothing but a toad or an earthworm. We should give up our former knowledge. If we look for certain excellent characteristics in a toad or an earthworm, such as radiant light or other Buddha virtues, then we still have not reformed our discriminating mind. Just know that what we see right now is Buddha. So, I think what he's saying here is, the kind of Zen teaching, right, is that, all reality is Buddha as it is. In more kind of traditional manifestations of Buddhism, or if maybe you were just kind of used to a more traditional Japanese Buddhist view, like some of these students would have been, you would have understood a Buddha to have certain characteristics, like radiant halo and certain marks on their body and so forth, because that's what the teachings say. So if someone in the Zen school is saying something like a toad or an earthworm is Buddha, that might be kind of hard to take. But he's saying, there is a reason that we are teaching in this way. So, you have to be patient and really take it to heart and not just reject it. So in this, if in this way we continually reform our discriminating minds and fundamental attachments according to our teacher's instructions, we will naturally become one with the way. Students of the present day, however, cling to their discriminating minds. Their thinking is based on their personal views that a Buddha must be such and such. If what they hear conflicts with their ideas, they say that a Buddha cannot be so. Having such an attitude and wandering here and there in delusion, searching for what reinforces their preconceptions, most of them never make any progress in the Buddha way. So, I think that this, again, in not just in aspects of Buddhism, but kind of in all aspects of our lives, we tend to do this. We have a certain existing view of how things are or should be, and if we encounter something that is different from those, we just push them away and go find something else that better accords with what we already thought. And I think that this is the cause of so much suffering in our lives. This is what we mean by aversion, right? Like we push away the things that we don't want, and we're only trying to bring in the things that we do want. But real freedom comes when we can just sort of be with whatever arises, because we can't, there's no way that we can control what's coming in and what's going out at any given moment. We can to a certain extent, but we're always going to fall far short. So cultivating a way to just be one with whatever arises is, just from a purely human point of view, important for achieving some degree of happiness. And obviously, from a Buddhist perspective, this is how we get beyond suffering. So when their teachers say, climb to the top of a 100-foot pole, then let go of your hands and feet and advance one step further, they hold their body dear and say, I can only practice while I'm alive. They do not truly follow their teachers. Consider this carefully. So this is from a famous koan story where, it's saying you have to climb to the top of a 100-foot pole and then let go and take a step out. And another theme in this text is sort of letting go of attachment to the body specifically. And I think that part of this was because Dogen was teaching mostly sort of fancy lads, the sort of aristocratic class of his time. So these people were probably all accustomed to very fine foods and comfort and so forth. So he really had to emphasize this fact that to really practice the Buddha way, you can't be attached to those kinds of things. You have to sort of learn to live rough and, again, accept just whatever arises. Okay, so next section here is book 6:18. So, and interestingly, this begins with a quote of the Chinese Zen master Dahui, who was sort of critical of the other person at the time, the Wanshi, who advocated silent illumination practice. So, even here, I think we sometimes have a fixed view about like the relationship between Rinza and Soto and so forth. So he's quoting kind of the person who invented koan practice and normally would be seen as sort of very not Soto, like the opposite of Soto, but Dogen respects him nonetheless. So Zen Master Dahui said, you should practice the way with the mental attitude of a person who owes 10 million strings of coins and is being forced to repay them when penniless. If you have this frame of mind, attainment of the way is easy. So this strings of coins, so if you've ever wondered why East Asian coins have holes in the middle, it's because you were able to tie them together and you could get a certain set number to sort of, I don't know, like 100 pennies, would equal $1. You could get, so they're sort of the right amount and tie them together with a string. So the idea here, though, is, a person who owes 10 million strings of coins being forced to repay them when penniless. So again, there's this idea of, giving up everything that you have, but then at the same time giving to the whole interconnected reality that we live in. So it's not about bringing stuff in; it's about going outward. This is the idea that Dogen expresses in Genjo Koan, right? When he says that awakening is when all beings come through us, not when we put ourselves into all beings. So it's this process of just sort of letting things come in as they are. This continues here. It is said in the Faith in Mind inscription, this is the Shinshin Ming, by that title, the ultimate way is not difficult. It only dislikes picking and choosing. So I like this. This is a kind of famous line, right? The ultimate way is not difficult. It only dislikes picking and choosing. So if you can just, stop picking and choosing, you'll stop suffering. It's as simple as that. When we cast away the mind of preference, we will immediately be able to accept the way just as it is. To cast away the mind that picks and chooses is to separate from ego-centered self. This is to say that we must not study the Buddha Dharma to accomplish the Buddha way for our own sake. So we're not practicing for this supposed self, this skin bag. We continue to practice the Buddha Dharma only for the sake of the Buddha Dharma, because the Buddha Dharma includes everything, not just this 5-foot being or whatever that Kodo Sawaki used to say. Even if we were able to study 1,000 scriptures and 10,000 commentaries and do zazen hard enough to destroy the floor beneath us, without this frame of mind, it would not be possible to study and attain the way of the Buddhas and ancestors. I think that this is a really important point, because often, I think people have the attitude in our tradition that just sit more, that's all you need to do is just sit more. Solution to any problem, you're just not doing enough zazen. But Dogen is very clearly saying here, even if you do zazen hard enough to destroy the floor beneath us, without this frame of mind, that is, without this frame of mind that we need to let go of the picking and choosing mind, it would not be possible to study and attain the way of the Buddhas and ancestors. So there is, even though our practice obviously emphasizes zazen, that's undeniable, it's not the only thing. We still need to do other stuff out in the world. We need to approach reality in a particular way. We can't just simply say, I did zazen today and that's enough. We have to behave and comport ourselves in a particular way. We must simply cast body and mind into the midst of the Buddha Dharma. If we follow our teachers without attachment to our former views, we will immediately be in accordance with the way. Dogen likes this, phrase, casting away body and mind. And I like this idea here, cast body and mind into the midst of the Buddha Dharma. And he talks about the ocean of the Buddha Dharma in other passages here. So this is, a sense of really recognizing that this self is fully impermanent and completely interconnected with everything else. And we need to live with that attitude. We can't simply serve ourselves and expect to get anywhere with our practice, even if we're doing zazen all day. So I think this is really something to watch out for, because we see, I think, people like this sometimes who do a lot of zazen but have a totally horrible attitude, And I remember early on in my practice sort of thinking like, if zazen works, they should be good people. Like, I don't get it. And I think Dogen is saying that right here. It's not just do this one thing and it'll fix all your problems. It's a full package deal. You have to do zazen plus other stuff. Okay, so this is the passage that's sort of checking the idea of blind faith. So, if you're getting worried that Dogen is advocating, giving up self to the point that you might put yourself in a dangerous situation, this is kind of a passage that is helpful with that. So this is Book 5, Section 1. He says, students of the way, we should not cling to our personal views. Even when we have some understanding, we should still think that there might be something not right with our views, or that there might be insights that are superior to our own opinions. We should visit widely with a variety of teachers, and we should investigate our predecessors' words. Furthermore, we should not firmly adhere even to the sayings of our predecessors. We should consider that their words might be mistaken, or even if we believe them, if there is a superior understanding, we should gradually develop our own understanding. So he's sort of almost saying kind of the opposite thing here, right? He's saying it is possible that our predecessors could be mistaken. And, Dogen and his teacher, there were certain texts that they criticized that other people valued very highly. So there's, famous text, the Shurangama Sutra, for example, that a lot of Mahayana Buddhists hold in very high regard. And Dogen said that this, was not a genuine scripture. It turns out that it probably was produced in China and not in India. That doesn't necessarily mean that what it says doesn't have value, but he was able to recognize that we can't just accept everything blindly because certain people feel a certain way about it. He continues here. Long ago, a certain imperial attendant monk visited the assembly of national teacher Zhong. So this is someone that Dogen really likes. He quotes from this person a lot. The national teacher asked him, "What color are the grasses in the south?" The monk said, "Yellow." He also asked a boy who was there, and the boy replied the same way, "Yellow." Then the national teacher said to the attendant monk, "Your view is not superior to the boy's. You said yellow. The boy also said yellow. You and the boy have the same view. If so, the boy could be the emperor's teacher and answer with the true color. Your view is not beyond the ordinary." Years later, someone commented, "What is wrong with the fact that the attendant monk's view is not beyond the ordinary? He said the true color just as the boy did. The attendant monk must be a true teacher." So saying, he did not accept the national teacher's opinion. From this, we understand that just as this person did not accept the ancient's opinion, we too should simply understand the true reality rather than accepting the view of an authority. Even though a doubtful mind is bad, it is also bad to cling to something we should not believe and to not investigate what should be investigated. So, this complicates things a little bit. Sometimes we're looking for, I think, an easy solution. Should we just accept everything? Should we reject everything? Dogen's sort of saying, you need to do both depending on what's going on. And in this particular example, the national teacher is someone that Dogen really respects and quotes frequently in his writings. But he's saying in this particular instance, maybe what he said here can be understood in such a way that it's not helpful. It's not totally clear to me what is meant in this passage, but Dogen at least is saying that understanding of it might lead to the wrong view. So we should, even though this highly respected person said it, we should take it with a grain of salt. Okay, so what am I doing on time here? Maybe I will read this last one and conclude with this. Okay, so this is Book 5, Section 2. The primary concern for students of the way must, first of all, be to detach ourselves from personal views. And we have a footnote here in the text that points out that the word that's translated as personal can also be sort of understood as Atman, or like, the self. Because the character that's used in Chinese, in modern Chinese, it's the character that means I. You just say I am doing X. You'd use this character I. In Japanese, though, it has more the sense of like ego, like Atman. And in Buddhist texts, it often has that meaning as well, sort of ego. So this can also be read as, we need to attach ourselves from views where we create like a substantial self. To detach from our personal views is to not cling to our bodies. Even if we penetrate the sayings and stories of the ancients and sit unceasingly like iron or a rock, if we attach to our bodies without letting go, we will not be able to attain the way of the Buddhas and ancestors, even if we practice for 10,000 eons or thousands of lifetimes. So again, he's reiterating the same point. Again, like it's not just zazen. You need to, do something with your mind as well in your approach to reality. Even if you sit unceasingly like iron or a rock for 10,000 eons, it's still not going to do anything. So it goes without saying that even if we are able to understand the provisional or genuine teachings or the sacred teachings of the exoteric and esoteric scriptures, but we are not free from the mind that clings to our bodies, We vainly calculate others' wealth without owning even a halfpenny of our own. So this is one passage where it might not be entirely clear without investigating what some of these things mean a little bit. So the provisional or genuine teachings, that refers to kind of the view that was held by the Tendai school at the time. So they held the Lotus Sutra to be the one kind of true, genuine teaching, and then all other scriptures were considered provisional teachings, because basically what the Lotus Sutra says is everything that I've taught before, that was just to help dumb people. I'm going to give you the real teaching right now, and it's called the Lotus Sutra. So that's basically how the Lotus Sutra presents itself. So that's why they had this notion of provisional and genuine teachings. Or the sacred teachings of the exoteric and esoteric scriptures. So this is just making a division between, so exoteric would be like normal teachings that are presented to anyone and anyone can read them, whereas esoteric teachings are associated with like sort of, like Tibetan Buddhism is, largely esoteric tradition. And in Japan, they have the Shingon school, also the Tendai school, to a certain extent, integrated some of these teachings. But the idea here was you were sort of initiated into a particular practice that was kind of secret. And often they have texts that are like very highly metaphorical, almost like coded. So that's what an esoteric teaching refers to. But if we're not free from the mind that clings to our bodies, we vainly calculate others' wealth without owning even a halfpenny of our own. So this is a point where I found we have a little problem to fix in the text, because we have a footnote that says that this line comes from the Avatamsaka Sutra, but it doesn't really explain what it means or what the context was. So I was able to find this passage this morning in the Avatamsaka Sutra, and there's a long sort of series of similes where this passage occurs. So it's basically talking about how even if you learn a lot of stuff about Buddhism, it's not going to amount to anything unless you practice. So these similes, this is from the Avatamsaka Sutra. So not solely with much learning can one enter the Tathagata's teaching. Like someone floating in the river, afraid of drowning, she dies of thirst. If one does not practice the Dharma, much learning is also like this. So this is one of these similes. Like, so even though you're in the midst of a river, you're afraid you're going to die of thirst. Like someone preparing gorgeous meals who does not feed themselves when hungry. If one does not practice the Dharma, much learning is also like this. So I think that's a nice metaphor there. Both of them. You're in the midst of everything that you need, but you're not taking it. And the next one is like someone virtuously prescribing medicine who cannot save herself when sick. If one does not practice the Dharma, much learning is also like this. And then finally here, like someone counting other people's treasures who has not a halfpenny to herself. If one does not practice the Dharma, much learning is also like this. So that's where that line comes from. So continuing, and then of course, Dogen here is changing it a little bit. So this, in the Avatamsaka Sutra, the original context is about studying a lot, but not practicing. But Dogen is talking about detachment from personal views. If we don't attain freedom from our personal views, then we have nothing at all, basically. Okay, so continuing here, I only ask you, students, to sit quietly and investigate the beginning and end of this body from the basis of reality. Our body, hair, and skin originally comprised the two droplets from our mother and father. When our breath stops, they will disperse and finally turn into mud and soil on the mountains and fields. So this expresses some like weird old scientific view of, I guess, how conception happens, the droplets from mother and father. But anyway, so how can we cling to our bodies? Furthermore, when we see from the basis of the Dharma, we are nothing but the gathering and dispersing of the 18 elements. So the 18 elements are, we chant them in the Heart Sutra. So that's eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, the things, the objects of those things, and then the consciousnesses that arise from them. Those are the 18 elements. Which one can we identify as ourselves? So which one of those 18 is the self? None of them. It's just a temporary collection of those things, right? Although there are differences between the teaching schools and the Zen schools, the teaching schools refer to non-Zen schools. The Zen school that is outside the teaching. They both show the ungraspability of the self from the beginning to the end and make this truth the basic attitude towards practicing the way. On this point, both are the same. First of all, we must penetrate this truth. Then the Buddha way will become truly clear. So, basically what this is saying is that, this is a very basic Buddhist teaching, right, about why we don't have a self, right? So no self is one of the most fundamental Buddhist teachings. And, he's saying if we examine our body and mind, we'll see that, this is really just an impermanent, constantly changing collection of aggregates, and clinging to it is foolish because, it's not a single thing. It's intimately connected with all of reality. It's not permanent. And ultimately there's no essence there in the self. And he's saying that, if we don't detach from personal views, we reinforce this false notion that the self is permanent and, essential. Okay. So just look at this real fast. Oh yeah, okay. So one other thing that I just thought was worth noting, I won't read the whole part here, but I'll just read a little excerpt from this because I think that this is something that we confuse a lot as Western practitioners in this tradition, and apparently even Japanese practitioners. So this is the beginning of chapter 5, section 6. So Dogen says, students of the way, you do not attain realization because you hold on to your fixed views. Without knowing who taught you, you think that mind is the functioning of your thoughts, knowledge, and views. You do not believe me if I say the mind is grasses and trees. So this is sort of similar to what he was saying before about if your teacher says that the Buddha is an earthworm or a toad, you have to just accept that. And here, he's saying that people think that the mind is just the functioning of, the brain in our heads. But he is saying, when I say it's grasses and trees, you don't believe me. And I just wanted to bring this up because this phrase mind is used all the time, right? In Buddhism, especially in Zen Buddhism, I think. And obviously we do tend to interpret it as meaning, the thoughts in our head. But mind can have so many meanings in the tradition. It's unfortunately quite confusing. So this idea of the mind being grasses and trees is pointing at the fact that everything that we perceive, and of course it does, kind of appear in our minds, but our entire reality is mind, and this comes from the Yogacara tradition. So that's sort of what is meant here, and this is getting at, this passage, Sokushin Zei Butsu. So mind itself is Buddha, and in that fascicle, Dogen, so this is from Shobogenzo, Dogen writes that upon hearing the expression mind itself, many foolish people consider that the thinking and sensing mind that has not yet aroused the mind of awakening is itself Buddha. Later in the same fascicle, he writes, we clearly understand that the mind refers to the mountains, rivers, and the great earth, the sun, the moon, and the stars. So we have to be really careful, I think, when we encounter this phrase mind in our practice, because when we hear something like this mind is itself Buddha, we're liable to think that this can mean, I have a mind, and even though my thoughts are all confused, I must be a Buddha already, just the way I am. But what's being referred to by mind is much more expansive than just sort of the mind consciousness, which is, one of those 18 elements. It actually includes everything. So again, this is, mind consciousness is, of course, where all our personal views are gathered. So we have to let go of that and accept, the whole world. So the mountains, rivers, the great earth, the sun, the moon, and the stars, we have to let all of that in and let go of our personal views. So I think I will wrap it up there. If anyone has any questions, I do my best to address them. Thank you.
So I was interested that Dogen really seems to see what we do when we're told that toads and earthworms are Buddha. Either, I mean, I love how he sees the two things that we do. One is we completely reject it. My teacher must be wrong. This couldn't possibly be true. And the other side is we follow the other piece of advice about accept what your teacher said. So we want to make those toads and earthworms into something. I think the way you said it was like they radiate light, and we want to see the light radiating out of the eyeballs of these toads and earthworms. But we want to make them exotic and make them something, because it's really hard for us to see the middle piece, which says we don't push that away and we don't write a story about it. We just say this is a toad and here's Buddha, right? So I thought I like how you kind of brought up the two things that we do. It's not just that we reject it. It's hard even for us to accept it, but once we accept it, we still miss the mark. Because we're still writing a story about what this magical earthworm is. I mean, we do it all the time in our practice, right? Because we're trying so hard to be good students and to see, the magic in the mundane. Oh, I'm going to make this thing a Buddha, rather than I can just let go of my personal views and see it for what it is. They know he's pretty smart.
Yeah. I mean,
he sees all the ways we go down that rabbit hole.
Yep.
It's not that easy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is if we do sort of accept that teaching without fully kind of understanding what it means, yeah, we are liable to think, oh well, if true reality is Buddha, then it must have special magical characteristics that I haven't yet recognized. But really, what it's saying is, no, the true reality that you've already known all along, just as it is, is Buddha. There's nothing that has to be added there. So yeah, that's a good point. Are you all able to hear the questions? Yeah. Okay. Good. Other comments or questions? Yes, Sagan.
Could you clarify that term, teaching schools? I'm not familiar.
Oh yeah. So my understanding is that Zen is the school that's beyond words and letters, right? So it is not a teaching school. All other schools, however, though, are somehow reliant on teachings in a way that the Zen school is not. So I think it basically means the Zen school and non-Zen schools. So even though, of course, there is an awful lot of Zen literature. Do I have that right, Hojo-san? Yes.
I was also curious, do we know much about the manuscript that, you said the more recent manuscript that was found? Do we know anything about, its origin or where it came from or where it was passed down?
Yeah, so it has a couple of colophons at the end. So basically like when someone would, because these were all hand-copied texts, so the person copying it would usually write at the end, like, I blah, 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 copied this at such and such a time. So I think it went through like 2 iterations of being copied, one of whom was like the bath attendant, I think. It's like not exactly clear why the bath attendant was copying this text. Although I think that's actually like a fairly high position, even though it sounds not that glamorous to us, maybe. Another instance of having to accept that toads and earthworms are good things. But I think that the actual manuscript is from the 15th. Do you remember what century it's from? Is it 15th century or later?
The original text was copied, I think, 14th or 15th century. And someone else copied this around, I think, 17th century or so.
Okay, yeah.
That is a little before Menzan's version.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, we don't have a very clear picture of how it got to where it is, but we do have a few little clues. It is nice that, in sort of East Asian tradition, that, people would tend to write these things at the end of texts with the, date, especially because Indian manuscripts, they have a much harder time, I think, often determining what time they date from, because that practice didn't exist as much.
And Doju, this is, whoops, sorry, Michael. Do you want to go first, or?
Go ahead, Fusatsu, and then I'll get.
All All right, Doju, thank you so much for your teaching this morning. Again, I really appreciated you talking about agency and not having to check your brain at the door with your teacher. But when you make a when you make a decision, it speaks to faith and trust. That's the thing. And then the second thing, I really appreciated you really explaining the view and the really reiterating. Not only it's just sitting, but you do have to have the mind and then the action of what that means. So those were two things I really appreciated that arose from the talk, and I really appreciated that. So I was just cracking up what you were like, yeah, just because he tells you go boil an egg, like, does that really work? So thank you.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah. So looking back at kind of like the editing of the text and how the text you and Hojo-san are working from is an earlier text than the Menzan text. Looking even at this earlier text, especially in comparison to something like Eihei Koruku, which are formally recorded talks, how much of Zuimonki, given that it is Eijo's notes, is Eijo versus Dogen? If you understand where I'm coming from with that, because are we getting Dogen written down, or are we getting Dogen through the lens of Eijo? Do we have other Eijo stuff to really compare that to and see? Not that that makes a large difference, but it's a curiosity.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I was actually thinking about this myself because, on the sort of front matter of the book, it has Dogen as the author of the text. And I think really it's sort of wrong, right? Because Eijo was the author. He was the person writing it down. And we don't really know the extent to which he might have modified things. So, it might be better to say sort of, talks of Dogen, like written as remembered by Eijo or something. I don't know how to deal with that exactly. But I think that we can have a sense that it's probably a pretty accurate reflection because so many of these things resonate with other things that Dogen was writing around the same time. So, in the footnotes for the text, Hojo-san often will bring in fascicles from Shobogenzo or from points to watch in practicing the way Gakudo Yojinju, which was written at the same time that these talks were being recorded. At least they overlapped. And they're often things that are, even sort of the way that they're phrased is quite similar. So I think that it seems that things are pretty accurately recorded. I mean, obviously, if you're just sitting there writing when someone's talking, it's hard to get everything. But I think on the whole, he seems to have done a pretty good job. The extent to which, he picked and chose, based on what he was personally interested in, that, we don't really know. Like, is this, a day for day kind of, he just wrote everything down, or was he only writing things down when they, had to do with something that he had a question about or was interested in? We don't really know that for certain. So I think we have to assume, to a certain extent, they reflect Eijo's interest. And there's also, I think, evidence too that the text was probably edited after, Eijo's death. Basically, these were like his personal notes. He didn't intend to publish them as a manuscript. Apparently, they were just found after he died, and his students compiled it into the text that we have now. So, as with all of these things, there's probably some editing and modification. But I think on the whole, it seems a pretty accurate reflection of Dogen's views. Another sort of anecdote, I think I shared this last time I talked about the text, but in Arthur Braverman's, I think it's Arthur Braverman's new book, he talked about visiting with Kosho Uchiyama Roshi, and seeing that there was a copy of this text, Shobogenzo Zuimonki, on his desk that was all tattered and torn up, and had obviously been used a lot. And he said something like, "Oh, you must really like this text." And then he pointed up to a shelf where there were 10 more copies. They were all equally beat up. Because apparently you could buy this book as in Japan, they have these little kind of mass market paperbacks, sort of mini versions of famous texts that you can get for really cheap. So I think Hojo-san noted too that when he would take train rides places, you could sometimes find this at the little train bookstore and get it really easily that way. So it's obviously in our lineage a very respected text too. So Hennesis, I saw that you had the hand emoji up there. Sorry, I missed you for a second.
Oh, yeah, so I guess like when I thought about it more, I kind of felt like my question might be slightly derailing.
It's okay.
And but if you don't mind me asking anyway, when we were discussing the idea of picking and choosing, I started thinking a bit about the sort of, I guess, thing of like on one hand in like our teachings, we try to do things that minimize suffering and things like that. And on the other hand, I'm thinking about these sort of like elements of like samsara and nirvana kind of being interconnected, and sort of like how oftentimes, especially in the modern day, people sort of think of things in terms of like maximizing happiness and minimizing suffering. And there's I guess a few sort of alternative views to that, like the Nietzschean view that like suffering has a lot of value to it, that that we should learn to love, or things like that. But for the most part, that's a very fringe view. And I would guess I was sort of wondering if like Dogen had many thoughts on this that are expressed.
Yeah, so I think that that's a good question. I mean, I'd say regarding kind of the value of suffering, I think that the Buddhist tradition does acknowledge that, because, you know, it says that the best position to be is as a human, because you have a lot of suffering in your life, not so much that you can't practice, like if you were in a hell realm or something, but not so much pleasure like if you're living in a heaven and you have no suffering impelling you to practice at all. So the tradition does say that we have to, you know, experience suffering before we can do anything about it. So I think that it's in accord with what you were saying there. Regarding picking and choosing, you know, I think maybe, you know, what you're getting at there is like we have to, you know, we still have to pick and choose, right, to like live in the world, right? So even though this is kind of suggesting that, you know, that line from the Faith and Mind inscription, the ultimate way is not difficult if only it only dislikes picking and choosing, right? So, you know, I'd say we can note here that at least the way that this is worded, it doesn't negate picking and choosing. You know, it says that the ultimate way dislikes picking and choosing. So I think the idea here is like that, you know, we should train ourselves to have that as our kind of basic mindset. But then when we have to pick and choose, which of course we have to do all the time because we live in, you know, a human realm where we have to do stuff, you know, we sort of try to do it on that ground, right? So the insights that we have gained from seeing interconnection with all beings, you know, that we're not separate from other beings, can help us inform the way that we do pick and choose, kind of ironically. So, you know, if I'm interconnected with all beings, and if I see that through the practice of not picking and choosing, then I can pick and choose in such a way that it acknowledges the fact that I am interconnected with other beings, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's an interesting paradox here, but it sort of, I think, works out in a nice way.
Do you think that sometimes, though, our aversion to suffering, sort of because we're picking and choosing, ends up just leading to a lot of unhappiness in ourselves and others that we have trouble acknowledging? Because I think that's also part of what I'm thinking here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's what this is all about, right? Is that, you know, when we base our lives on personal views, you know, it leads, you know, to suffering, because we can't possibly fulfill all of those things that exist in our minds, what we want and what we don't want. You know, we're never going to achieve those things, even if we're the wealthiest people in the world. You know, you can't stop, you know, aging and sickness, for example. That's the Buddha's original conception of reality, right? So yeah, I think that doing our picking and choosing on the ground of this awakened reality of seeing interconnection, seeing impermanence, seeing no self, doing picking and choosing on that basis rather than on the basis of, you know, what serves my interests or my group's interests. You know, that's the way out of suffering, I think, according to the tradition. So does that help?
Yeah, now that I ask, and it's probably just because I'm half awake. It's like, oh, duh, I remember reading that stuff.
Oh, no worries. I mean, that's why we get together and why we practice, because all of these things, I think, they're counter to our biology, right? Like, our basic worldview is to serve the self. That's the way our minds are set up, so that we can, survive in a hostile world. So it takes constant reinforcement, right, to sort of view the world in the way that we want, so the way that we should. Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, so this conversation is kind of fascinating because you kind of talk about, we have some ideas going in the West. So you keep talking about the freedom from personal views, which I thought was really interesting because it makes me think of kind of the way that we tend to usually think about like freedom as a freedom of rather than a freedom from, right? Mm-hmm. And we tend to have a lot of values that we like to have. We know that we like freedom of speech. We know we like freedom of choice, or the freedom to do as we please. But that freedom itself is somewhat anxiety-inducing, right? Because it leads to these things where the onus is on us as an individual to choose, to pick, to do. That we have to have certain views of the world, or that there's more pressure to be able to, whether it's chase wealth or to have the right perspectives. And it seems that like the freedom from is in some sense like an antidote to that freedom of, right? And so it's like, okay, yes, you have that freedom of personal views, but you also have that freedom from it, which can sometimes quell that anxiety of the freedom of. I don't know if I'm completely
No, I think that's really insightful. I think that the way that freedom is understood in the Western and maybe especially the American context is quite the opposite, I think, of what the Buddhist tradition is showing us. Because and I think the way that you phrase that, freedom of rather than freedom from. The teacher that I first practiced with, Rosan Yoshida, he was fond of saying that freedom is not licentiousness, which is like, a big word, but it stuck with me, maybe because that word choice. But, we in the US sort of do conceive of freedom that way, that's like sort of the hippie freedom, just do whatever you want, please the body, please the self, make the world into a, hedonic pleasure hell, that's sort of where we are now, right? Everything is just sort of set up so that, individuals can, feed themselves, and that's freedom in kind of the American conception. But obviously that's totally counter to what the Buddhist tradition is teaching. And I think that, there was a line in here, let me see if I can find it real fast. He talks about, if you only have exposure to, well, I can just paraphrase. He basically says that, those who aren't used to associating with others, who are only kind of used to spending time with their family or their group, they are the ones that have the hardest time with this, right? Because they can't let go of their own personal views and accept that, other people might view the world differently than they do. And I'd say for me, this was one of the most kind of valuable lessons that I got from joining a Sangha, because I'd never really been part of a group like that, because in normal American life, you can just kind of ignore the people that you don't like. You can just kind of shut everyone else off and, do the stuff that you want to do. But being in a Sangha, you're forced to be with people that you might not necessarily agree with. And, again, I think, sort of like good advice being harsh to the ear, that might be harsh to your sensibilities at first. But I think when you practice with it for a while, you realize the value of just accepting other people for who they are. And, I think that's why maybe Sangha is so emphasized in the Buddhist tradition, because it helps us to let go of our ego-centered view by, having to deal with other people. And I think, monastic practice is really good at, at doing this. So if you ever are like in that kind of container where you're just around a bunch of people 24/7, you really have to practice with that. So I'm sure Hoko and Hojo-san probably attest to. So anything else, or should we wrap up?
Real quick.
Sure.
I just want to say one thing. You said the awakenings like stuff coming through you, going out. appreciate that.
Oh yeah.
But my question is, I want to hear more about the mind is grasping trees, you said.
Oh yeah.
I'm wondering about the metaphysical stance around that, I guess. I hear it as like the reality or the existence of the grasping trees has something to do with its experience in the mind, or its presence in my faith. I don't think that that's right.
Yeah, so I think this sort of maybe gets back to what Hoko was saying. When we hear something like that, we might think that it's a really strange or different way of viewing the world, but really, I think it's basically saying that nothing's special. When we perceive the world, the stuff that's out in the world includes things like grasses and trees, tiles and pebbles is the other part of the line, fences and walls, I think also. And, I think what this is saying is that, all reality is here, because when we perceive the world, right, all that stuff is coming into our mind. And in that sense, it's not separate from us. So it's not the case that I'm a self here and that stuff is out there in the world and we're, fundamentally disconnected. But all of that stuff is my mind, There's no disconnect between me and you right now, For me, you're fully in my mind. So there's no separation, that's this tradition really emphasizes this non-dualism aspect, that we're not separate things. I'm not a subject, you're not an object, we're one package, one bright jewel, as Dogen likes to say. So I don't know if that makes sense or helps.
Yeah, I think I was thinking of it in the wrong direction. I thought it was talking about the world, it's talking about objects.
Yeah, I mean, and again, they're not separate, right? So there's no, yeah, I mean, I think our, that view of the world is so, again, it's like the way our language works is set up to make us think that way all the time. You can't even like make a sentence without having a subject and an object. So, that kind of way of seeing reality is very deeply ingrained. So it's very, counter to common sense. So it takes some working with it to sort of see what's being said there. So does that make sense?
Untitled Buddha is a huge teaching, which he could talk about for another 2 weeks. So don't worry if that didn't make it through the sentence. That's a deep investigation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it comes from, and Dogen, if you're interested in looking at it further, there's the text, Jiju Zanmaizen Bendowa, right? Yeah. So in monasteries, they often will chant this text called Jiju Zanmai, which is an excerpt from a larger text called Bendowa. And Bendowa is, what's your translation of the title?
Wholehearted practice of the way.
Right. So Hojo-san has a whole book on it, and it should be up in the library. But the actual text is fairly short. And like Shobogenzo Zuimonki, it's pretty accessible compared to a lot of Dogen's writings. And it has sort of an introduction that includes the Jiju Zanmai part, and he quotes this fences, walls, tiles, pebbles, grasses, and trees part. And then he also has this question and answer section where it's some deluded person asking him questions and he corrects them. So it's a really good text to check out if you want to kind of explore that further. And he, really Dogen is touching on that in all of his writings, so you can really look anywhere, but he does explicitly mention it there. All right, so go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, everyone.
Michael has a...
Oh, sorry, Michael, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, kind of jumping off that, looking at this idea of, mind as everything, as like, Suzuki Roshi would call big mind. In Dogen talking about this as fences, walls, tiles, and pebbles, it takes this idea of non-dualism to a very almost like tactile and visceral place. And, you brought up in talking about that at the end, the Yogacara school, and obviously historically that influenced that to some extent. Dogen seems to take this to a slightly different place, or at least to a different illustration from what the Yogacara school does. And I know a couple of years ago you gave a talk referencing this, but I'm curious in terms of getting down to like the philosophy, the metaphysics of what Dogen's talking about, is Dogen's view of mind as fences, walls, tiles, and pebbles aligning with or significantly different from something like alaya vijnana, storehouse consciousness?
Yeah, so I think that, yeah, I mean, Dogen's like the exact, I think generally when think, to get, I might use some philosophical language here, but so, metaphysics or ontology, right, is like the study of what is. So what is reality like? And in Western philosophy, that's a really important topic. I think that in Buddhism, it's not so important. What's really being kind of emphasized is what we would call soteriology. So like what leads to salvation. And sometimes things that you might point at as being metaphysical or ontological views, are actually really just sort of trying to direct us towards salvation, towards nirvana. So I think maybe focusing too much on like, what is their view on like how the world really is not as important as understanding how might it help us see the world correctly in a way that's healthy and relieves suffering. So that's, I guess, the first point. The second point would be Dogen, it seems didn't really study Yogacara teachings directly, probably. I'm sure he had some exposure, and of course in Japan at the time there was a Yogacara school, the Hosso sect, which was still prominent at that time. So, I don't think he would have been unfamiliar with these ideas necessarily, but I think the point that I was trying to make maybe is just that word mind, since it's so tied up with the Yogacara way of seeing the world, was probably influenced by that philosophy. So I don't think that Dogen would have had really a particularly like Yogacara view of the world. He was probably more, if you wanted to divide Buddhism into like that or Madhyamaka, the kind of middle way, emptiness type stuff like the Heart Sutra, he was probably more in line with that. But really, I think that they're pointing at the same thing anyways. It's just, I think maybe this particular term, mind, being so bound up with the Yogacara conception of the world as being only mind, is bound to sort of have some influence on how that word is understood in Buddhism. So I don't know if that helps. All right, so let's go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, everyone.